What do anthropologists do? Our goal, as we've discussed, is to get at the question, what does it mean to be human? But how do you get at something like that? Can you just walk up to someone and say, hey, excuse me, can you please tell me what it means to you to be human? It doesn't really work that well. Usually we're either shunned or we get some answers that don't quite get at the nuance and level of complexity that we're really aiming for. And so what anthropologists do is they engage in field work. Now, field work isn't a word that's specifically unique to anthropology. Of course, in many fields, people do field work. But what does anthropological field work look like? The most common form of anthropological field work is called participant observation. Participant observation, the term is not rocket science, you can kind of figure out by the words that it means both participating and observing. Now, what's important about this term in particular, participant observation, is that it's not one or the other, but that really both things are happening at the same time. Participant observation means that as we go to the field, as we are in the community that we're studying, for whom we're trying to find out the answer to the question, what does it mean to this particular group of people to be human, we don't just stand back and kind of take notes on a piece of paper, stand behind people's shoulder and make them nervous and just say like, oh, just go ahead and do your thing. I'll just be taking a few notes over here. That's a really bad way to do field work. For one, because it makes people nervous and then they don't act like they might if you weren't around, and for another, because you're really getting such shallow level of engagement with the culture itself that you're really missing out on some really juicy, important parts of the culture. So there are some very particular contexts for doing participant observation, and so the first one, as the word might imply, if you're participating, it means that you have to be somewhere. The first fundamental component of participant observation, of anthropological fieldwork, is to be there, to be an eyewitness. You can't learn about a culture, at least not from an anthropological perspective, by reading a book about it, or seeing a movie, or even talking to people from that culture when you're not in the culture itself. Sure, you can learn something, it's not nothing, but if you're really trying to get deep into the meaning of how these people experience what it means to be human, what's the underlying logic that animates people's everyday lives, you really have to be there. So we go somewhere, and going somewhere seems kind of obvious, but it's a fundamental part of participant observation. Sometimes we go very far or to very exotic or unusual places, and sometimes we go to a Walmart parking lot, which seems very mundane, but you can actually learn a lot from. The second component is being there for an extended period of time. Just spending an afternoon somewhere is interesting and probably really fascinating in all kinds of ways, but it's not sufficient for producing a meaningful analysis of what it means to be human. An afternoon is not enough, a weekend is not enough, even a week or a month, people would argue, is not enough. So how long is long enough? Well, there's no hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, people say that to do real efficient and meaningful anthropological fieldwork, you probably want to be somewhere about a year. A year is a good amount of time because you see the full cycle of the seasons. If there are any holidays or ceremonies that are associated with a particular part of time, you get an opportunity to observe them. Being there for a year probably means that you have opportunities to see all kinds of different activities, some that are major and that it maybe involve a lot of members of the community, maybe others that are more minor or intimate that might involve only a few people in the community. A year gives you enough time to observe those things. Furthermore, a year gives you a good amount of time to develop meaningful relationships with the people that you're working with. If you're gonna try to get at what it means to be human to these people, then just spending a weekend with someone is really not going to give you that answer. You want to build relationships, you want to build trust, you want to be able to learn what people's everyday lives look like and how that helps you understand what it means to be human to this group of people. The third component, and this really leads out of the second one, is learning to speak the language. We absolutely do not feel that speaking with people through an interpreter or only speaking to people who speak your language is sufficient. It limits dramatically the number of people that you're able to engage with if you're only working with an interpreter or if you're only working with people who speak your own language. And maybe more importantly than that, we know from the readings that you've done so far and even from your everyday lives, we know that language is so deeply embedded with culture that learning the words that people use is fundamental for understanding their culture. Language and culture are reflections of one another. Language reflects culture, and culture is reflected in the language and shapes people's language use. And so speaking the language is a fundamental, important part of anthropological fieldwork. Without speaking the language, you miss out on important nuances of the culture, and you miss out on a significant portion of the community members. In some cases, like in my case where I do fieldwork in the United States, it may appear that simply speaking English is enough to communicate with people, and in some levels it is, but it's also important to remember that different cultural contexts have their own special culture that grows out of that context. It might be work related, it might be a cultural thing, and so being able to communicate on a basic level is obviously a very good start, but it's not sufficient. You really want to take it to the next level and learn the language, the everyday use of communication that people use. The fourth component of anthropological fieldwork is paying close attention and learning in depth about various practices and belief systems. Part of your work as anthropologists, and work is a funny sort of word because it is really fun, but it is also truly work, because our job as an anthropologist is to do this, is to learn what is appropriate and inappropriate to do in certain contexts. What do people say when some things happen? What people do not say when those things happen? All those little rules and nuances that children learn as they're growing up is what we as anthropologists try to subsume also, what we try to embody and learn and understand. As we learn what's appropriate and inappropriate, what you say and what you don't say, how you react to certain contexts or certain behaviors, how you don't react to certain behaviors, as we do that, we start figuring out what's really the most important question of anthropology, and that is why. In some ways, anthropologists are notorious for never having left the terrible twos. No matter what we encounter, the question is always, but why? Why do you do that? Why does that make sense to you? Why did you say that? Why didn't you say that? Oops, why did you consider something that I thought the appropriate response? Why did you consider it inappropriate? And the answer to why really tries getting us, or it really starts getting us towards the philosophical underpinnings of what it means to be human to this particular group of people, and that's really what it's all about. Most of us believe something, and then we do things that contradict our beliefs. Sometimes we believe that we believe some things, but when we look at our practices, they actually don't go along with that at all. That's actually normal for all cultures. It's not something that just we do. In every culture, there are these tensions between what people believe and what they do, and being there and doing anthropological fieldwork allows us not to say, oh, this is right and this is wrong, or look at these people, they contradict each other, but really to see the richness that develops between the things that people believe and the things that people do, to really see the kind of thick, meaningful tensions that exist between what might seem as a contradiction. This is why participant observation is so fundamental, and why really being there with your body is so important. We can learn things intellectually, we can use our brain to understand things that people tell us, but it's only when our body, the rest of the muscles in our body, not just the brain, are also engaged in the learning process, that we can understand a culture on a far more nuanced and interesting level, so that it's not just an intellectual understanding, but it's also a real embodied learning experience. There's a real different experience between going somewhere or finding out that in a culture many people are agriculturalists and they grow and harvest corn, and actually going and working in the field with people and seeing how your body learns to interact with the tools and with the earth and the plants themselves, to see what your body feels like at the end of the day when you've been crouched over all day and your muscles feel sore, to feel what it means to have a relationship with corn after you've labored over it for days and months and sometimes years, and that becomes part of your ethnographic, anthropological understanding of what it means to be human to those people. Not to mention that at the end of the day, after you've worked in the field with a group of people and labored and contributed your own force and energy into supporting the community, the level of interaction with community members is far more intense and nuanced and meaningful. The level of conversations and the kind of information that you might get from a community is a lot more interesting and rich. Finally, the last part of ethnographic fieldwork is really not so much the fieldwork itself, but it's taking all that information, taking all that material, and processing it into an analysis. Analysis usually comes in the form of writing, so ethnographic books like the one that we'll be reading, ethnographic articles, but they could also sometimes be an ethnographic film, an ethnographic art exhibit, or an ethnographic photography or artwork. The important part of it here is not so much what the venue is, but really the analysis of it. We don't just pour out everything that we've discovered. Oh, these people do this and these people do that, and there's this many people, and just kind of a reporting. It's really analytical. So it's taking those pieces of information and, again, going back to that basic question of why, trying to explain what are the underlying logics that give meaning to these people. What's the philosophical outlook that explains why these people are doing these things and not other things? Why this behavior is appropriate and not this other behavior? It helps us to understand why pouring or rubbing mortuary juices on one's body is not just a disgusting, yucky thing that those crazy people on the other side of the ocean do, but actually has a meaningful philosophical reason, a logic that shapes how people understand what it means to be human.